As I see it, Marxism is not a closed system in which you just have a set of bodies. On the contrary, I see Marxism as essentially open-ended, which enriches itself, indeed I would say reconstructs itself by taking into its corpus scientific work done in other traditions, including the non-Marxist tradition. Now, in that sense, therefore, incorporation of Keynes's basic economic ideas into Marxism is not a problem at all. And especially not a problem because many of these ideas, the fundamental ideas of the principle of effective demand, already appeared in Marx himself, not to mention Rosa Luxemburg or Mikhail Kalitsky, who came to the Keynesian ideas before Keynes. So the real difference lies not with regard to the economics. The real difference lies with regard to the perspective. You see, Keynes basically saw capitalism as a malleable system, a system in which irrational outcomes could be avoided through the application of correct ideas. Irrational outcome is something which he saw as a state of affairs from which every section of society can be made better off if you move out of that state of affairs. In other words, society may periodically get trapped into a state of affairs from which a movement would actually benefit everybody, but nonetheless it gets trapped, and that's the irrationality of the outcome. But you can find your way out of these irrational outcomes if you have correct ideas. Of course, the Depression was the classic example of an irrational outcome. If you got out of the Depression, workers would benefit, capitalists would benefit, everybody would benefit. But the fact that you had to get out of the Depression required a correct idea, such as Keynes' own. But of course, the analogy of the Depression is something which really carried forward even to the world of social conflicts. A social conflict really is an irrational outcome. If you get out of the social conflict, almost every section of society would be better off than they were when they were in the social conflict. And therefore, that, according to Keynes, made it possible to have preemptive negotiations such that you don't get into social conflicts. And that's what gave capitalism the kind of malleability, that it was a system in which you could actually have preemptive negotiations such that you have, through correct application of theory, neither conflicts nor crises. Now, as opposed to this, I think Marx basically saw capitalism as a spontaneous system, a self-driven system. It's not a malleable system, it's a self-driven system which is subject to certain tendencies of its own. And what is more, ideas are always linked to class interests. The dominant ideas happen to be those which are espoused by the dominant classes, and consequently, it was inevitable that the system would always be caught in crises and conflicts.
It's hard for me to believe that a version of Marxism is going to take over as the dominant ideology of neoliberal capitalism from neoclassical economics. Although, curiously enough, this might not be so crazy. In fact, the version of it that would probably take over would be Ricardian, would be a Ricardian version, not a specifically revolutionary Marxist version. But I think something more like the economics of Smith and Ricardo might be in the cards, an economics that says class divisions are the way the society has to be organized. And the real question of economic policy and economic organization is how do you manage a class-divided society and its relationship. Keynes, well, as ideology, Keynesianism had a kind of run. Perry may discuss this more because he has this wonderful book about the money interest and the public interest that discusses this issue. Keynesianism had a kind of run as the dominant ideology. And one of the interesting things to me, since I was brought up through that period, is how come it didn't work better? Why was it so unstable? As far as I can tell, the mainstream Keynesianism of the 1950s and the 1960s really did not collapse because of internal intellectual inconsistencies or a failure to deal with the stagflation crisis of the 1970s. It basically collapsed because it was unstable ideologically in the dynamics of American scholarly and academic debate. Now, the question then is, again, what could take the place of that? Perhaps it would be a neoclassicism which had been leavened very, very substantially with ideas like externalities and social coordination issues. That's certainly one idea. Or a neoclassicism which shifts from rationality as an apology for the institutions of capitalism to behaviorism as an apology for the failure of the institutions of capitalism. I mean, this is like the English teacher in the book The Way It's Supposed to Be, who came into the teacher's lounge and said, "I'm a good English teacher. The problem is these students aren't good students." So you could have an economics that said, we have an excellent system, we just don't have the right people to operate it.
The central idea of the money view that I want to emphasize, and it's something that Minsky in early work called the survival constraint or the reserve constraint, or maybe you want to call it the liquidity constraint, that every unit in society, every unit, meaning you, me, businesses, Goldman Sachs, the United States, faces a pattern of cash commitments and a pattern of cash flows today and stretching on into the future. And if today cash inflows are insufficient to meet cash commitments, there's only three things you can do. You can either dishoard, meaning drawing down your money balances, but you run out of those money balances. You can borrow, which really just means shifting the survival constraint into the future, when hopefully it'll be easier to deal with. That's the goal. Or you can liquidate, which means selling assets for whatever the market will give you for them. That's a financial crisis when you get to stage 3. So the focus of the money view is really on the second of these, and on the rate, that is to say, borrowing, and on the rate of interest that is charged to put off the day of reckoning, as I would say, in this way. From the perspective of the money view, the money rate of interest, the overnight rate of interest, is a sensitive barometer indicating the degree to which the pattern of cash commitments is matching up with the pattern of cash flows in the economy as a whole. So it's a barometer, but even more it operates when the system, to the extent that the system is self-regulating, which is limited. To the extent that it's self-regulating because of that, okay, that this short-term rate of interest operates as a coordinating signal, telling people that to hurry up and pay their bills. Higher cost of delaying the day of reckoning means that those who can pay more quickly will, so allowing scarce lending resources to flow to those who most need them. So, and this basically, the money view views this constraint, day by day liquidity constraint, as the central disciplining feature, the central coordinating feature of market economies. And it's not much, it's a bit of a weak read. So we have all these economic theories about intertemporal budget constraints and transversality conditions on into the infinite horizon, some notion that people are forming plans and coordinating their plans out into the distant future. And those are views that the economy might be in equilibrium. Okay? But when you take away into these fictions, I mean, these are wealth constraints. The only thing that constrains behavior is wealth, and you can sort of allocate it any way you want over time. The liquidity constraint says it really matters at what time your cash inflows are coming in and at what time the cash commitments are coming due. And you can form, views about what the future should look like and act on those, but there's no particular reason for them to be consistent with one another. And so we have the inherent instability of credit. This is Bagehot. This is Hawtrey, the great British central banking tradition. This is Keynes. There's a side of Keynes. This is Minsky.
what in effect capital does is it never resolves its crisis tendencies, it simply moves them around. It moves it from one thing to another. We've been through a crisis of financial institutions. Actually, we're now in a crisis of sovereign debt of states. And actually, that crisis seems to me a very difficult one and ain't going to go away. And to some degree, you can see how it shifted from one thing to the other and what that has really been about. So what this suggests then is that capital accumulation has been running into certain difficulties. With a low wage, low profit margin economy, what many capitalists started to do, what many moneyed people started to do was not put their money into production, but to start to buy up assets. So we start to get speculation on asset values. And asset markets are Ponzi-like. People buy into them, the prices go up, and so people say, oh, that looks good, put more money in, prices go up. They have a Ponzi character. And we've been through asset bubble after asset bubble after asset bubble. And the strange thing is everybody thinks this crisis is new. But you look back and see what happened in East and Southeast Asia in 1997-98, what happened to Argentina in 2001. We've forgotten already that the savings and loan crisis that occurred in this country. We've forgotten about 1973 and the property market crash and all those kinds of things. This last 30 years have been crash after crash after crash after crash. And it's been like that all along. And this one is, in effect, part of that kind of process. So I have 1 minute to kind of say, when we understand that, one of the things that immediately comes out is that you have to start to think seriously about an anti-capitalist transition. And if you're not prepared to think about an anti-capitalist transition, you're simply going to go back into crash after crash after crash, in which you're going to get fictitious values created, they're going to fall apart. That is where we're going to be headed. And furthermore, if you look at the class character of this, which I haven't had time to get into, the class character of this has been about greater and greater concentration of economic power in a smaller and smaller elite. And if you say, can they preserve themselves, the answer is, hell yes, they can, unless they're stopped. And that means class struggle.